In 1943, November, dawn is breaking over a narrow strip of coral and sand called Betio Island, part of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. And at this exact moment, the ocean itself has become an enemy because the tide is lower than planners expected, and hundreds of American Marines are about to learn that the distance between their landing craft and the beach cannot be crossed quickly, quietly, or safely, as the first waves of the 2nd Marine Division approach the island in amphibious tractors and Higgins boats, engines vibrating, radios crackling, and officers staring ahead at a shoreline that looks deceptively small, flat, and quiet, unaware that nearly every yard of that beach has already been measured, sighted, and prepared for them by Japanese defenders who have spent months digging trenches. And as the sun rises higher, reflecting off the lagoon and the steel hulls of the landing craft, the moment begins, and there will be no cover where they are about to land. The operation unfolding is part of Operation Galvanic, the first American offensive across the Central Pacific, and its success or failure will shape the direction of the war against Japan, because Tarawa is not just another island, it is a test, a proving ground for a strategy that demands amphibious assault after amphibious assault across thousands of miles of ocean against enemy positions built specifically to stop such landings. And the men approaching Betio on this morning are the first to face that reality head-on, under conditions no exercise or rehearsal could fully replicate. The year matters because 1943 is a turning point. The United States has regained momentum after the disasters of 1941 and early 1942. Victories have come at Midway and Guadalcanal, but confidence is still fragile, and every major operation carries political, military, and psychological weight. And Tarawa has been selected not because it is easy, but because it sits astride vital Japanese air routes and must be taken to protect future advances toward the Marshall Islands, and because American planners believe it can be seized quickly in a matter of days, with acceptable losses, based on intelligence that underestimates both the strength of the Japanese defenses and the complexity of the terrain. Betio Island itself is less than 2 miles long and less than half a mile wide at its broadest point. Flat, treeless in many areas, ringed by a coral reef that extends hundreds of yards from shore, and surrounded by a lagoon that looks calm and inviting, but hides the most critical variable of the entire operation: the tide, which on this morning is lower than expected, exposing the reef and turning the lagoon into a shallow obstacle course of jagged coral heads that can rip open hulls and force men into the open water under fire. The Japanese garrison on Betio is commanded by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, a veteran officer who has promised to superiors that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. And while that statement is hyperbolic, the preparations behind it are real, because Shibasaki's forces, numbering around 4,800 men including Imperial Japanese Navy Special Landing Forces and construction troops, have spent months digging trenches, pouring concrete, and placing coastal guns and positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire that cover every likely landing area, especially the northern beaches facing the lagoon, where American planners have decided to land. The Japanese defenses include heavy coastal guns salvaged from old battleships, mounted in concrete bunkers, along with dozens of pillboxes, log and sand revetments, and spider holes, all carefully camouflaged and sighted to survive naval bombardment and continue firing once the Marines reach the beach. And Shibasaki has ordered his men not to attempt to repel the Americans at the waterline, but to let them come ashore and then destroy them where they are most vulnerable, exposed, crowded, and disorganized. The American assault force is the 2nd Marine Division, commanded by Major General Julian C. Smith, a formation with combat experience but not with an amphibious assault against a fully fortified atoll. And within the division, the assault regiments include the 2nd, 8th, and 6th Marines, each assigned specific beach sectors designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3 along the northern shore of Betio, with detailed plans for waves of landing craft, timing, supporting fire, and rapid movement inland once the beaches are secured, because the entire concept of the operation depends on speed, on overwhelming the defenders before they can recover from the initial shock of naval and air bombardment. In the days leading up to November 20, American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers have pounded Betio with shells, while carrier aircraft have attacked gun positions and airfields. And while this bombardment has destroyed some installations and killed some defenders, it has not neutralized the Japanese defenses as thoroughly as hoped, because many bunkers are well constructed, deeply dug, and designed to withstand heavy fire, and because the bombardment, while intense, has been shorter than what would later be used in similar operations, in part due to concerns about ammunition expenditure and the belief that Tarawa's defenders would be sufficiently weakened. As the assault begins, the first waves are carried in amphibious tractors known as LVTs, which can crawl over the reef and deliver troops directly onto the beach. But not every unit has enough of these vehicles, and many Marines are assigned to Higgins boats, which are faster and more numerous but cannot cross the reef if the water is too shallow, a fact that planners have considered but ultimately underestimated, assuming a higher tide that will not materialize at the critical moment. At 8:30 in the morning, after hours of bombardment, the landing craft begin their run toward Betio, engines roaring, wake spreading behind them, Marines packed tightly together with rifles, ammunition, packs, and radios, faces set, eyes forward, because training has emphasized aggression and momentum, the idea that once the ramp drops, hesitation can be fatal. And yet, as the boats move closer, signs of trouble appear almost immediately, because some LVTs are hit by artillery fire, others are slowed by mechanical issues, and the lagoon, instead of being deep enough to carry the Higgins boats to the beach, begins to reveal its true depth, or lack of it. When the first Higgins boats reach the reef, they stop abruptly, hull scraping against coral, engines straining uselessly, and the Marines inside realize that they are still hundreds of yards from the shore, with no choice but to climb over the sides and wade forward, weapons held above their heads, packs dragging them down, because remaining in the boats under fire is not an option. And at this moment, the Japanese defenders, who have waited patiently through the bombardment, open fire with machine guns, rifles, and mortars, sending streams of bullets and bursts of shell fire into the shallow water, turning the lagoon into a killing zone where there is no cover, no concealment, and no way to move quickly. The effect is immediate and devastating because Marines are forced to move slowly through waist-deep water, struggling against the drag of their equipment and the uneven footing of the coral, while under direct fire from multiple directions, and because officers and non-commissioned officers, easily identifiable by their actions and positions, are among the first targets, disrupting command and control almost as soon as the assault begins. And radios, essential for calling in naval gunfire and coordinating movement, are soaked, damaged, or lost as men fall or stumble. The planned rhythm of the assault, carefully timed waves landing in sequence, breaks down within minutes as boats pile up at the reef, some drifting, some disabled, others turning back to pick up more troops, creating confusion and congestion in the lagoon. While on the beach, the first Marines to reach the sand find that the bombardment has not cleared the defenses behind it, and that the seawall running along much of the shoreline provides the only immediate cover, a low barrier of concrete and coral that can shield a man lying flat behind it, but only if he can reach it. On Red Beach sectors, elements of the 2nd and 8th Marines struggle ashore under intense fire, and the beach itself is narrow, crowded with wounded men, damaged equipment, and bodies, while beyond the seawall, Japanese bunkers and trenches remain active, their fields of fire overlapping, making any movement inland extremely dangerous. And because the Marines are landing piecemeal rather than as cohesive units, many small groups find themselves isolated, pinned down, and unable to advance or retreat, clinging to the seawall or shallow depressions in the sand, waiting for an opportunity that does not come. General Julian Smith, observing from offshore, quickly realizes that the situation is far worse than anticipated, reports coming in slowly and incompletely, if at all, because communications are unreliable, and the picture that emerges is one of stalled progress, heavy casualties, and units unable to execute their planned maneuvers. And yet the assault cannot be halted, because withdrawing under fire across the reef would be just as deadly, and because Tarawa must be taken, regardless of the cost, to maintain momentum in the Pacific and to prove that the United States can carry out such operations. Naval gunfire support, intended to shift inland as the Marines advance, must be carefully controlled to avoid hitting friendly troops now dangerously close to enemy positions. Using hand signals, shouted orders, and example, because formal command channels have broken down and because survival depends on immediate action, such as knocking out a machine gun position with grenades, moving a wounded man out of the line of fire, or dragging a radio into a position where it might still function. The psychological impact of the landing is profound because expectations of a rapid advance inland have been shattered, replaced by the reality of being pinned to an exposed strip of sand under constant fire, with no clear sense of progress or reinforcement. And because the Marines can see their comrades struggling in the water behind them, some unable to move, some trying to push forward, all under the same relentless fire. And yet training and discipline keep them in place, firing back where they can, conserving ammunition, and waiting for opportunities created by naval fire, airstrikes, or the arrival of additional LVTs that can bring more men and heavier weapons directly to the beach. As the morning wears on, casualties mount, particularly among the first waves, and the beach becomes increasingly congested, making movement even more difficult, while Japanese fire remains intense and well-directed, because the defenders have rehearsed the scenario, and because their positions allow them to fire from protected angles, often invisible to the man they are hitting. And although some Japanese guns have been destroyed or suppressed, enough remain active to maintain pressure along the entire landing zone. The seawall, meant to stop erosion, becomes a lifeline, a thin strip of relative safety where Marines crouch or lie flat, returning fire when they can, while behind it the interior of the island remains largely intact, with coconut log bunkers, trenches, and command posts still connected by covered routes that allow the defenders to move and resupply under fire. And Shibasaki's men, disciplined and determined, continue to fight according to plan, focused on inflicting maximum casualties at the water's edge. Offshore, the situation is equally tense, because landing craft crews are exposed as they attempt to deliver additional waves, some boats taking hits, others grounding on the reef, and because commanders must decide how to adapt the plan in real time, reallocating LVTs to the most critical sectors, pushing additional units ashore despite the chaos, and calling for more aggressive naval gunfire against known or suspected enemy positions, even as friendly troops are dangerously close. By midday, it is clear that the assault has not achieved its initial objectives, and that the Marines on Betio are holding only a tenuous foothold along parts of the northern beaches, with no secure penetration inland, and with Japanese resistance still strong. And yet the decision is made to continue reinforcing the beachhead, because to pause would give the defenders time to regroup and counterattack, and because the only path forward is through the fire, across the sand, and into the fortified interior of the island. Individual acts of bravery and determination occur constantly, though they are not part of any grand narrative at this moment, because survival and mission come first, and because the chaos of the landing makes it impossible to see the larger picture, as Marines work together to move heavy weapons into position, set up makeshift command posts, and evacuate wounded men back across the lagoon, often under fire, while the sound of gunfire, explosions, and engines creates a constant, overwhelming noise that leaves little room for reflection or fear, only action. The tide, slowly rising, begins to help later waves, allowing more LVTs to cross the reef, but the damage has already been done because the first hours have cost the assault force dearly, and because the Japanese defenders have not been broken. And as more Marines reach the beach, they add to the pressure on the defenders, but also to the congestion and confusion as units intermingle, leadership remains fragmented, and the narrow beach offers no room to maneuver. As afternoon approaches, the Marines on Betio face a stark reality. They are ashore, but barely. their foothold fragile, their losses heavy, their objectives unmet, and the Japanese defenses still largely intact. And with daylight fading and no clear breakthrough achieved, the question looming over the battlefield is not how quickly Tarawa will fall, but whether the Marines already on the island can hold their ground through the night, because the moment that began at dawn has not yet reached its outcome, and the most dangerous hours are still ahead. The sun continues its slow movement across the sky as the afternoon of November 20th, 1943 presses down on Betio Island, and the Marines who have clawed their way to the narrow strip of sand along Red Beaches 1, 2, and 3 now understand that the landing was only the beginning, because the island has not been cracked open. It has merely been touched, and every yard forward will have to be taken under fire, with exhaustion already setting in, with units shattered and mixed together, and with the original assault timetable completely gone, replaced by a brutal improvisation driven by necessity rather than plan. The Japanese defenders, many of them still protected inside reinforced bunkers and trenches, continue to fire methodically, conserving ammunition, targeting movement, and exploiting the fact that the Marines have no depth, no rear area, no safe zone behind the beach, because the lagoon behind them is just as deadly as the island in front of them, and the seawall that offers minimal protection also traps them in place, turning the beach into a narrow corridor of danger where men can only crawl, crouch, or lie flat, waiting for moments when enemy fire slackens enough to allow a rush forward or a withdrawal backward. Communication remains the greatest obstacle because radios have been destroyed, soaked, or rendered unreliable. Runners are cut down as they try to move along the beach, and officers struggle to determine where their companies are, if they still exist at all as organized units, while General Julian Smith, still offshore aboard his command ship, receives fragmentary reports that paint a picture of heavy casualties and minimal progress, but offer little clarity on what forces are actually holding ground and where the enemy remains strongest. On the island itself, leadership devolves to whoever is closest and still capable, and small groups of Marines begin to act independently, identifying Japanese firing positions by muzzle flashes, smoke, or sound, and then working their way toward them using whatever cover exists, often nothing more than shell holes, debris, or the bodies of wrecked landing craft. And when they reach a bunker or emplacement, they rely on grenades, rifle fire, and sheer persistence to silence it, because heavier weapons like tanks and artillery have not yet been brought fully into play. Tanks were meant to land early in the assault to provide mobile firepower and shock, but many have been delayed, damaged, or knocked out as they attempted to cross the reef or move off the beach, leaving the infantry without the support they expected. And when some tanks do reach the sand, they become immediate targets for Japanese gunners, who have prepared specific positions to engage armor at close range, using anti-tank guns and concentrated fire to disable or destroy them before they can influence the fight inland. The psychological strain on the Marines intensifies as the hours pass because fatigue sets in quickly under the tropical sun, and the Marines know that holding their fragile foothold after dark with limited visibility and disrupted command will be even more difficult than surviving the day. Along portions of Red Beach 2, elements of the 2nd Marines managed to organize a limited push beyond the seawall, advancing a short distance inland by exploiting gaps created by naval gunfire and airstrikes. But these advances are costly and slow, measured in yards rather than objectives, and every movement forward draws immediate attention from Japanese defenders who respond with accurate fire, forcing the Marines to ground again, sometimes within sight of their next objective but unable to reach it. On Red Beach 3, the situation is even more precarious because Japanese fire remains particularly intense, and the terrain offers fewer opportunities to maneuver, resulting in a concentration of Marines along the seawall with little ability to advance, while casualties continue to mount and medical personnel work under fire to treat the wounded, often with minimal supplies and no way to evacuate them quickly, because moving back across the lagoon remains hazardous and dependent on the availability of landing craft willing to brave the fire. Offshore, commanders make the decision to continue landing reinforcements despite the chaos, because the alternative, leaving the men already ashore without support, is unacceptable, and additional waves are pushed toward the island, some using LVTs that can cross the reef, others still forced to rely on Higgins boats that ground short and require their passengers to wade the remaining distance, repeating the same deadly process that characterized the first waves, though now with some benefit from suppressive fire directed at known enemy positions. Naval gunfire becomes more aggressive and more precise as spotters on the beach manage to relay target information, sometimes using improvised methods, and battleships and cruisers fire at close range, shells screaming overhead and detonating just beyond the seawall, shaking the ground and temporarily silencing some Japanese positions, creating brief windows during which Marines surge forward, dragging weapons and wounded men with them, trying to consolidate gains before the enemy recovers. Despite these efforts, progress remains uneven and fragile because every advance exposes flanks, every silenced bunker reveals another firing position behind it, and the interconnected nature of the Japanese defenses means that eliminating one position often brings Marines under fire from another, forcing them to repeat the same dangerous approach again and again, while the defenders, though taking losses, remain disciplined and committed to their mission, fighting from prepared positions and making the most of the terrain. As the afternoon wears on, the tide finally rises enough to allow more LVTs to reach the beach, bringing with them heavier weapons, additional infantry, and limited supplies, and this begins to shift the balance slightly. Because the Marines can now bring machine guns, mortars, and flamethrowers closer to the front, increasing their ability to suppress and destroy fortified positions. But the effect is gradual rather than decisive, and every gain must be paid for in time, effort, and lives. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, observing the battle from his command post, recognizes that the Americans have established a foothold but have not yet broken through, and he continues to direct his forces to hold their positions, maintain fire discipline, and prepare for counterattacks when opportunities arise, confident that the narrowness of the island and the exposed nature of the landing beaches still favor the defense, especially as darkness approaches. By late afternoon, parts of the Marine beachhead begin to show signs of cohesion, as surviving leaders manage to regroup scattered elements into more effective fighting units, establish clearer lines of control, and coordinate limited advances inland. But these efforts are constantly disrupted by renewed Japanese fire, sudden casualties, and the physical exhaustion of men who have been under continuous stress since before dawn, with little food, little water, and no relief. The beach itself becomes a grim testament to the cost of the assault, cluttered with damaged equipment, abandoned packs, and the wounded waiting for evacuation, while the seawall remains crowded with Marines pressed shoulder to shoulder, each man focused on his immediate sector, scanning for movement, firing when a target appears, and waiting for orders or opportunities that may not come before nightfall. As the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lagoon and the island, the urgency increases, because whatever ground the Marines can secure before darkness will be critical to surviving the night, and small groups make desperate pushes to seize key positions just inland from the beach, such as sections of trench or the edges of airfield structures, knowing that even a shallow depth can provide some protection against counterattack and allow for better fields of fire. These pushes succeed, and Marines dig in quickly, using tools, helmets, and bare hands to scrape shallow fighting positions in the hard coral soil, while in others, the attacks are repulsed, forcing the men back to the seawall under heavy fire, leaving them no better off than before, and reinforcing the sense that progress is fragile and reversible. Offshore, senior commanders debate whether the operation can still succeed without unacceptable losses, but the reality of the situation leaves no real choice because the Marines are committed, the enemy is engaged, and withdrawal would be catastrophic, both militarily and politically. And so the decision is made to press on, reinforce success where it appears, and accept the cost. As darkness approaches, Japanese fire begins to change in character, with more probing shots, flares, and movement detected inland, suggesting preparations for nighttime action. And the Marines, aware of Japanese tactics, brace themselves, redistributing ammunition, checking weapons, and establishing overlapping fields of fire where possible, despite the confusion and the mixing of units that makes clear coordination difficult. The first day on Betio was drawing to a close, but the battle is far from decided, because while the Marines have managed to establish a tenuous presence on the island, they have not yet broken the Japanese defensive system, and the coming night promises no respite, only new dangers, as the men on the beach prepare to hold what little ground they have gained against an enemy that has not yet been forced to yield. And as the last light fades, the question hanging over Tarawa is whether this fragile foothold can survive until morning. The night of November 20 to November 21, 1943 settles over Betio Island with an uneasy quiet broken by sporadic fire, flares arcing overhead, and the distant rumble of naval guns offshore. And for the Marines holding their precarious positions just inland from the beaches, darkness brings no comfort, only uncertainty. Because the ground they occupy is shallow, uneven, and poorly defined, units are intermingled beyond recognition, and the enemy remains close, disciplined, and determined, using the cover of night to probe American lines, test weak points, and reposition within the maze of trenches and bunkers that still dominate much of the island. Japanese defenders attempt localized counterattacks in accordance with their doctrine, moving in small groups rather than mass charges, trying to infiltrate gaps between Marine positions. But exhaustion, losses, and the growing density of American firepower limit their effectiveness. And while some firefights erupt at close range, the Marines manage to hold, firing carefully, conserving ammunition, relying on overlapping fields of fire and mutual support where possible, and drawing confidence from the fact that they are no longer entirely exposed on the open beach, even if their grip on the island remains fragile. Offshore, American ships maintain constant vigilance, illuminating suspected movement with star shells and firing when targets present themselves. And this naval presence becomes a psychological anchor for the men ashore, a reminder that they are not alone, even as isolation defines much of their immediate experience. As dawn approaches on November 21, the Marines prepare for renewed action, knowing that daylight will bring both opportunity and danger, because it will allow better coordination and observation, but also expose them once again to well-sighted Japanese fire. And when the sun rises, it reveals an island scarred by bombardment, littered with debris, and still bristling with enemy positions that must be taken one by one if the battle is to be won. With the new day comes a shift in momentum, subtle but real, as additional reinforcements and equipment finally make it ashore in greater numbers, thanks to improved tidal conditions and the relentless efforts of landing craft crews. And among these reinforcements are more tanks, flamethrowers, mortars, and artillery pieces that can be brought forward to support the infantry, transforming the nature of the fight from a desperate struggle for survival at the water's edge into a systematic, though still costly, campaign to dismantle the Japanese defensive network. Command and control, while still imperfect, begins to improve as surviving officers and non-commissioned officers regroup their men, establish clearer lines of responsibility, and coordinate attacks with supporting fires. And General Julian Smith, now receiving more coherent reports, gains a clearer picture of the situation, recognizing that while the first day has fallen far short of expectations, the Marines have endured, and endurance itself has created the conditions for eventual success. Protecting the armor from close-range attack and moving in to clear positions once they are neutralized, a slow, methodical process that contrasts sharply with the chaotic landing but proves increasingly effective against fixed defenses. Flamethrowers, used sparingly and with caution, become particularly valuable against bunkers that resist conventional fire, forcing defenders to abandon positions that have survived hours of shelling. And while the use of such weapons is physically and psychologically demanding for those who carry them, their impact on the battlefield is undeniable, breaking strong points that have stalled progress and opening paths forward. Japanese resistance remains fierce, especially around key positions such as the airfield and command bunkers, but the defenders are now under constant pressure from multiple directions, their ability to maneuver restricted, their communications degraded, and their numbers steadily reduced by the cumulative effect of infantry attacks, armor support, and continued naval and airstrikes. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, still attempting to direct the defense, finds his options narrowing as American forces penetrate deeper into the island, isolating pockets of resistance and cutting off routes of movement. And while his men continue to fight with determination, the strategic reality is shifting, because the Americans now possess the initiative, the depth, and the firepower needed to sustain the assault. Throughout November 21, progress continues unevenly but persistently, with Marines advancing yard by yard, clearing trenches, securing intersections, and consolidating gains before moving on, often under fire, often at close range, and always with the awareness that any lapse in coordination or momentum can result in sudden casualties, because the enemy is still capable of sharp, localized resistance. By the end of the day, much of the northern portion of Betio is under American control, including significant sections of the airfield, and while Japanese resistance has not collapsed, it has been fragmented, forced into isolated pockets that can be addressed individually rather than as part of a cohesive defensive system. And this fragmentation marks a turning point in the battle, even if it is not yet fully apparent to those fighting on the ground. The night of November 21 to November 22 brings further fighting, but the character of the battle has changed, with fewer organized counterattacks and more isolated engagements as remaining Japanese units attempt to resist from strong points or conduct limited, desperate actions. And the Marines, now better dug in and supported, are able to respond more effectively, maintaining control of key terrain and continuing preparations for the final push. The Japanese defenders, cut off from reinforcement or resupply, continue to fight according to their code and orders, but their ability to influence the outcome is steadily eroded, and as American forces close in on remaining positions, resistance becomes increasingly localized and sporadic, though no less dangerous to those tasked with clearing it. By the morning of November 23, organized Japanese resistance on Betio is effectively broken, though isolated fighting continues as Marines methodically search the island to ensure that no pockets remain capable of launching attacks. And it is during this phase that the full cost of the battle becomes clear, as casualty reports are compiled and the scale of the losses sustained in the first hours of the landing is fully understood by commanders and troops alike. The Battle of Tarawa, lasting just 76 hours, has resulted in more than 1,000 American dead and thousands wounded. Casualties concentrated heavily in the first day, and especially in the landing itself, and nearly the entire Japanese garrison has been killed, a reflection of both the intensity of the fighting and the nature of the defense mounted on the island. The immediate outcome of the battle is the secure capture of Betio Island and Tarawa Atoll, opening the way for further operations across the Central Pacific. And while the victory is costly, it provides invaluable lessons that will shape future amphibious assaults, including the need for more thorough bombardment, better intelligence on terrain and tides, increased use of amphibious vehicles capable of crossing reefs, and improved coordination between naval, air, and ground forces. For the Marines who fought on Betio, the battle leaves an enduring imprint, defined less by strategic analysis than by the memory of those first hours in the lagoon and on the beach, when cover did not exist and survival depended on persistence under fire. And while the island itself is small and remote, the significance of what happened there is immense, because Tarawa proves that fortified islands can be taken, but only at great cost, and that the path across the Pacific will demand both adaptation and endurance from the men tasked with carrying the war forward. And as the smoke clears and the fighting ends, Betio stands as both a hard-won victory and a stark warning of the challenges that still lie ahead in the vast expanse of the Pacific War.